You're listening to Talking Threat Intelligence, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the new challenges of today's threat landscape. Each episode, we connect with some of the world's leading practitioners to share stories from the front lines of corporate security. And now, on to the show.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Talking Threat Intelligence, sponsored by LifeRaft. I'm your host, Robert Value, and my guest today is Nick Gicinto, Executive Vice President at Red 5 Security. Nick, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
All right. Now, Nick, last time we chatted, you said something I thought was really interesting. You said that OSINT analysts need to spend more time learning about the blockchain because it can be a really powerful tool for analysis for your clients. And I just thought that was super interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that blockchain is one of those areas in cryptocurrency, you can add that together with it, where some people know a lot about it at this point. They got into it early, they've educated themselves, but I think most people still kind of feel like it's this nebulous sort of kind of space where people who want to be risk takers, they'll throw their money in this and, high risk, high reward. But that's about as much as they know about it. They don't really spend a lot of time understanding the power of all the data that exists in the blockchain as an open source investigative tool. And I think that's an area, considering finance and fraud is increasing exponentially in this space. And more of our own companies or our clients, customers, friends are going to be potentially subjected to theft or fraud on this space. And we need to know more about it.
Like you said, when you're thinking about what's in the media, a lot of the crypto and the blockchain thing, it's this speculative investment, and it's been debatable about what the normal applications are. But one group that has definitely embraced it has been cyber criminals and other criminal groups that have definitely exploited it right now.
I was picking up something from CNBC. I think that there was 14 billion in cryptocurrency that was taken by scammers in 2021. And that was like up 79% from the previous year. So I think, bad actors out there, they're always looking for the next thing. I always found, investigating bad guys was very much a cat and mouse kind of game. It's a different tactic for them to take, but I think they feel a lot of safety in the anonymity or the perceived anonymity of blockchain. And I think they gravitate to that because they see it as low risk, but potentially high reward.
Right. So let's take this right from the beginning, maybe for people that like you said, there seems to be people that are experts in this or people that haven't taken the time to learn much about it at all. So let's start right at the very beginning. What do you mean exactly by the blockchain?
Yeah, so the original blockchain was Bitcoin. It's been around for quite a while. I think most people wish they would have learned about it a lot sooner than when they actually did.
Definitely me.
Yep. You're not alone there. And the blockchain is really the way to describe any number of different chains that exist now. I mean, there's hundreds of them, and probably more at this point, where information is stored on a distributed ledger that is contains certain data, certain pieces of information about a transaction or whatever you happen to be storing in little blocks of information. And as they connect and transact to other entities, a new block is created each time a transaction occurs. And that is stored and validated across a number of servers, really as many as your chain supports, I suppose. And it's done in that way so that it's decentralized and hopefully immutable, right? So it's the idea, if you hack one of those servers, you won't be able to affect the outcome of the chain because the other other servers will validate the actual price or the actual transaction, and whatever dissenters in that group are sort of counted out based on almost a democratic process, right? The majority rules.
Just to throw this off to make sure I got it right, but from what I've seen, the main purpose is have this decentralized system to confirm all the transactions that are out there, using more the wisdom of the crowd, so that it's harder to make fraudulent transactions and things like that.
Yeah, I think the idea is really to create or validate truth, right? And to do it in a way that it's transparent, that everyone can see it, and it provides some measure of anonymity, but it at least the nature of the transaction is publicly visible, and that because it is validated across a number of these nodes that exists to maintain the continuity of the transactions, it is exceptionally hard to hack it or crack it. If you think about thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of servers out there validating and confirming one chain at a time, how could you possibly mount some type of an attack that would overwhelm that? It'd be exceptionally difficult.
So let's now turn this to the applications for OSINT analysts. And like you were saying, this is because there's so much more transparency out there with blockchains and the different cryptocurrencies that are now available and the transparency that brings. What has that meant for you as an OSINT investigator and the type of challenges that you can tackle with this?
Yeah. So I don't know how many times, I would get a call from somebody saying, "Hey, I've got this project, need an investigation. Are you able to, to trace finances and, get bank record details?" And I mean, that's always an exceptionally hard thing to do. And in most cases, it's no, I can't, because I don't have access to somebody's private bank accounts, and nor would I be able or even want to try and do that. But it's different when you're looking at the blockchain, because everything is available on the chain and in open source. And so now when you're looking at financial crimes or fraud, or simply just following the money as a very helpful investigative tactic when you're trying to either uncover identities or piece together what happened in this situation or what have you, now you have a medium that you can investigate. And because so much fraud, criminal activity is perpetrated using cryptocurrency. I mean, think about ransomware payments typically are requested in cryptocurrency, phishing scams, even hacks of Discord servers and things of that nature. Really, it all boils down to a crypto transfer. And so open source investigators, they have an opportunity to get into a new area of open source data that can significantly enhance their ability to conduct investigations. But I found that it's still relatively a new phenomenon, and not a lot of folks have embraced that just yet.
So what are the kind of different challenges that you can now conquer by looking at transactions on the blockchain?
Yeah, so you get to follow the money right from your own computer, right from the comfort of your own home. It no longer requires trying to piece together a number of different gaps and obviously information that's typically might only be available through a subpoena and a civil lawsuit or something, where you get that information through. Obviously, law enforcement has ways to get that information, which is great. But for the most part, open source investigators aren't going to have those tools at their disposal. So how do you participate in investigations related to financial crimes? Well, if the financial crime occurs on the blockchain, then you have the ability to do it from soup to nuts yourself without having to bring in any outside entities. And because it's all public and open source, there are tools that exist for free to be able to look into these transactions.
One of the examples that we were chatting about beforehand was the Mango exchange, which I thought was quite interesting. Can you elaborate a bit more on that one?
Yeah, so I mean, this was back in October, and there was the DeFi, decentralized finance exchange, Mango. There was a manipulation that occurred that over $100 million was exploited. And Mango is a Solana DeFi exchange. Solana just being one of the types of protocols that has a token associated with it. And it was one actor using two different accounts and essentially a short position with one account, then using the other account to create a leverage position and working those two against each other to boost the price from something like 2 cents to like 91 cents, which you may think like, okay, whatever, no big deal. It's not even talking a dollar, but when you've got 400 million of those, that those pennies add up.
Better in return than what you're getting on a GIC right now.
Oh, no question. Absolutely. So yeah, with that particular instance, they use something like 10 million in USDC, US dollar coin, and they took out over 116 million in Mango with minimal fees. So it was quite quite efficient by these sorts of standards, and it literally brought the whole exchange down because of that. And so that's just an example of there's a lot of very sophisticated actors who do know the blockchain exceptionally well, and just I think a lot of it based on education and opportunity, they're taking advantage of a lot of flaws in the system.
Well, it's just so new, right? I've been amazed with this crypto boom that we've just kind of gone through. There's a great YouTuber, CoffeeZilla, who's done some incredible investigative journalism, looking at how watching these transactions in the blockchain, seeing how they're all connected, and then catching connections between different influencers with pump and dump schemes and different things like that. Whereas, if you were in the traditional financial markets talking about pump and dumps in equities, there's no way as a private investigator of any site, you're going to be able to catch any of this stuff or talk about it. You need the SEC or the government to step in. But with, like you said, with the blockchain, where it's so transparent, huge new opportunity if you know how to read this stuff.
Absolutely. The greatest asset to an investigator is data and having access to the data. And the example you talked about with traditional securities, you're not going to have the data exists, you just don't have access to it. With the blockchain, it exists and anybody can access it. And that creates a powerful tool. Now, the question is, how many people right now are accessing it for these purposes? And there's just not a lot yet.
Well, let's make that number a bit bigger then, Nick. So if I'm an OSINT analyst and I want to start learning about how I can incorporate blockchain research into my investigations, where do I even get started with this?
Well, so the internet is your best and worst enemy for this, because obviously there's a ton of information that's going to help you get up to speed. And many who are in this space are self-taught, because it's just it's evolved organically as new platforms and protocols are created, and people go and they learn and listen. And Etherscan is the predominant tool for doing a lot of this work, open source and for minimal to no cost. And so that's there. I think the flip side of the coin is that there's so much disinformation around the crypto space on the internet too. You have to be exceptionally careful where you get your information. But then if you want to, cut right to the chase, you can get Chainalysis Reactor certified, and Chainalysis is one of the top investigative blockchain companies that's out there. There's several others in the space, but they have platforms. They're pay for use platforms, but they'll train you on them, and those certifications to use their platforms actually accelerates the ability to do investigations much faster.
That's interesting there. Obviously, with OSINT being such a new field, it's a lot of self-taught work. But if you have someone that's done the work before you, I'll include a link to that in the show notes for this, so that people can find those. You mentioned there that I clued into disinformation can sometimes harm your learning curve with this stuff. What do you mean by that specifically?
I wasn't really familiar with the term FUD until I got into the crypto space, but once I did and understood, how much fear, uncertainty, and doubt exists, that's the crypto world's term for misinformation and disinformation. And because so many people get into this space who don't necessarily know a lot about what they're doing, I don't want to say they're easily manipulated, but the conditions are there for them to be manipulated if they don't do a lot of their own homework. A lot of the information that does exist, even when you're trying to do basic research, if you don't have the knowledge to sort of call BS on some of these things, when it's clearly someone who's pushing a certain position, or their statistics just don't quite add up, it's really hard to know when that's the case. I say stick to some of the mainstream sources for that information, but even then, be really mindful about whether or not the articles you're reading are paid for content, right, by a sponsor, because you will find a lot of that gets up on some of these online platforms, and they're all subject to sponsorships. I mean, just the same way that newspapers are. They run ads, online, or back in the day when we used to actually read newspapers, in our hands. The same thing applies in the crypto space, but I just find it to be a little bit more prevalent there.
In terms of like the negative consequences that could come from that, do you mean like buying a cryptocurrency of some sort and just having your money stolen, or could that impact your OSINT analysis in some way? Like what?
I mean, I suppose it could, right? You obviously, if you're going to invest in anything, you should make an informed decision and do your own homework, and everybody can choose how they want to invest their funds, but obviously, I would want to be a little bit more knowledgeable on something before I dump a lot of my money into it. But I think the other thing is, from an OSINT investigator standpoint, there's a lot of data that's out there and a lot of information. And in the course of conducting an investigation, you really need to validate the sourcing around that. And that can be tough sometimes. And that's where I want to always pay close attention to whether or not something is sponsored content, or is what I'm investigating, does the entity that's pushing this content out, do they have ties or associations with somebody who might have a position against whatever I'm looking at? All those factors have to be taken into account in the crypto space, because there's so much money that does trade hands in the background, and entities are working together to push a particular position. Some may be working against each other. I actually found it ironic in the DeFi space. The whole concept of DeFi is to be able to push all of these resources to people, so that they can do things using these decentralized protocols that they wouldn't be able to do in a centralized financial system. Yet some of these DeFi protocols actually it's very territorial, and they actually battle each other. And I just find that so ironic. I think the point should be to create as many opportunities for people as possible. That's the spirit of what DeFi is. But I find that users are loyal to one platform, and so they'll try and trash another platform, and it's really just kind of a funny space.
Yeah, well, it's like there's a common ideology, but that doesn't mean there's not the bickering. Like just a really wild example I'm thinking of the top of my head is like the communist. There'll be the Communist Party and the Leninist Marxist Party, and you're like, to any outsider, you're like, well, that's all far left stuff, right? But they're squabbling about the smallest differences or whatever, and within those communities, it's a big, serious debate. But and there's a lot of money involved too.
It's a great example, and if you spend much time places like 4chan or on some of these discords where a lot of this community lives, you really do see how much infighting goes on between some of these groups, and it is quite comical at times, actually, to read some of the comments. But you have to respect and appreciate the fact that rivalry does exist, and therefore be very careful about where you get your information.
Right. All right, Nick, the second topic that I really wanted to chat with you, and one of the other interesting things that we were chatting about before we hit record on this episode, is one of the big mistakes that you see a lot of people in the OSINT community or corporate security making. And you said intelligence professionals do sometimes a really bad job at presenting up to management, and this can reduce the impact that they have with executives or in the organization. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I can talk about a little bit of my own experience in that, because I came out of the government, U.S. government. I was there for 10 years, and I get myself into the private sector, and I don't think about the business case mindset that we have to make so much or so often in the private sector, in particular, around moving certain initiatives forward, or definitely asking for money is the big one. And that wasn't the mindset that I had to be in. I was very mission focused and mission oriented, and then I would go to my boss and say, "Hey, this is the mission. This is what it takes to accomplish the mission." And I didn't have an appreciation or understanding at that particular time for all the different factors that go into senior managers' decision around allocating funds. And so what I think has been helpful for me to think about is, first of all, taking my own time to investigate and understand what are the broader priorities of the organization, and how does the organization function? What are who are the different players and stakeholders? Who is my boss going to have to go make a case to and justify something to? And getting ahead of those requests that you plan to make by doing some of that homework. And I always try to just hand it to my manager on a silver platter, if I could. but it takes a little bit of time and a greater appreciation for the bigger issues at play in an organization.
Yeah, I've had so many great guests on this podcast talking about their experiences transitioning from something like law enforcement or another government agency to the private sector, where they got to be like addressing the ROI of their program, which is nothing you normally don't have to think about otherwise, right? Or how does this help our shareholders or something like that, and how that kind of plays into and like you said, the budget. And it's a totally different skill set that a lot of people have to take the time to develop.
Yeah, definitely. And I think back to to a couple of times in the private sector or early on in my transition to the private sector, where I think managing expectations is so important even before you go and ask for something, because I've worked with senior leaders or even CEOs of companies that think, well, I'm hiring you, you know what you're doing, you've had success in this, you're the magic bullet. And they don't understand that it takes data and people to be able to run a good intelligence or security program, and rarely can companies afford both, I found. I think especially in tech companies, there can be an over reliance sometimes on a technical solution. So we'll get this tool, it'll automate, it'll scale, it'll fix everything. I don't need human analysts, or what's the value of a human analyst in this process anyway? The goal is to get away from that. It's not true. You need great data so that great and talented analysts can investigate and can help you make data-driven decisions by telling you what it means. And I think those are expectations that have to be managed at the onset of taking a new role or looking at a position where you're expected to accomplish a mission or you have objectives, but to help that manager understand these are the components that are required to run an efficient and effective program. Because I remember going to a place like Tesla, for example, and prior to my arrival and the the security leader that hired me, Tesla hadn't really had a centralized security program. They had a lot of little fiefdoms of security all over the company. And to show up as a new program, a new centralized program, and getting some headcount to do that is awesome and it's fantastic. But you need investigative tools, you need open source tools, you need program management tools, you need all those things. And I just don't think that corporate leaders are necessarily prepared for that unless those expectations are managed. And you want to do it up front.
Well, you have a great investigative background or a great security background, but then no one's teaching you how, like you said, how do you ask your boss for more money or the budget for these kind of tools? And have you dealt with issues like that where you made a request and then it was denied because you didn't ask it in the right way? Or
yeah. And one prominent example comes to mind, and it, the lesson, I'll tell you the lesson up front is you need to understand what your boss wants to hear and needs to hear, or how they need to hear something before you just plop that proposal on their desk. And it was a lesson that I learned early at my time at Tesla. There was for the growth of the program a couple of different platforms that we thought would be exceptionally helpful for us to do what we needed to do in running security investigations. And I remember doing a lot of homework and spending a lot of time, evaluating solutions. And, my plan was, well, I'm going to present the preferred solution. We'll get the approval, we'll get the sign off, and, and here we go. And so I had the vendor come out to Tesla headquarters. We were going to meet with Elon and present it to him. One of the vendors came dressed in a suit. And I didn't know prior to that that's a huge turnoff for Elon, or was a huge turnoff at that time for Elon. That most people work very casually at the factory and other Tesla facilities, and there's so many in the Silicon Valley kind of mindset where you're it's like, which black hoodie am I going to wear today out of my 15 black hoodies? And I brought in a vendor who was wearing a suit, and the meeting was dead on arrival. It had, and it wasn't this guy's fault. It obviously was my fault because I didn't take the time to understand what will be credibility enhancing or potentially credibility killing at that time.
What were you thinking at the start of the meeting when you walked into the room with the suit and you saw Elon's reaction?
Well, I don't know. Can you bleep things out on the podcast? Because that's what I was thinking. But yes, I thought, well, we're here, we're in it. We just got to do the best we can to sell it. But the whole just vibe of the meeting was sort of off. And afterwards, his chief of staff comes out and he's like, "Hey, dude, don't bring people in suits. Like, you got to tell these guys, especially if they've got the government sort of vibe on them or work in that space. You got to tell them they got to dress down, because it just it gives them the wrong impression." So, I appreciated that tip. If I had heard it 30 minutes prior, that would have been super helpful, but never made that mistake again. And it was just one of several lessons I learned on how to be a little bit more successful when approaching the boss with various initiatives.
Yeah, well, definitely in the tech space too. I'm thinking back from my experiences as well, like coming from the financial industry, which is very suit and tie, and then learning to work in a tech startup. And then that dress code, it just instantly, if you're not dressed in the same way that everyone else is, it just instantly builds this barrier between you and your colleagues that you're trying to, and you need to build those bridges, especially in security, where you don't really have the authority to tell people what to do necessarily. You're kind of, you got to get that buy-in from everybody, because and if you have that extra barrier just because you're dressed too sharp or whatever it is, and you don't fit in, boom, the relationship's off and it's preventing you from accomplishing your mission.
Well, security is a huge trust business. And so, it's not the place where you want to look like or be the outsider. It's very much a you, me, same kind of thing. And so I think, you're absolutely right about that. That first impression, he was, this particular vendor was sized up within 5 seconds of walking through the door, and it was over. It was over.
So
I never made that mistake again.
So what pieces of advice would you give? Like, obviously, like that the clothing is one issue and an important issue, but what other tips would you give for someone who's trying to build better relationships with management when presenting like a vendor or a budget or something like that else that they need to get done?
Yeah, I'm gonna use my favorite Ted Lassoism, which I think he said was originally Walt Whitman, which is be curious, not judgmental. So investing the time and understanding, what information do you need, or would you need to feel comfortable making the decision, or feel comfortable taking to the people that you need to get approval from. And maybe you don't directly ask, but you can certainly, pick things up through osmosis and just be really observant around, I present something this way and it goes over well. When I present it this way, it doesn't. And really kind of just, you have to adapt. You have to adapt to the people that you're presenting to. It's not going to be the other way around. You have to think about any time a manager is going to their supervisor and asking for something extra, they need to be put in a position to be successful. And your proposal or whatever you're giving them, you may be like me walking into that meeting where you're dead on arrival because you've already failed to check a very important box. And so I think that's the key in my perspective, is really to understand how can you make your manager be successful taking your proposal going forward where you're not in the room and be able to accomplish the goal that you've set forward. And that does come through a lot of listening, asking questions, and really trying to get a bigger perspective and picture to understand, why is this likely to be successful now, or maybe now's not the right time. Timing can be very important in these things too. If my company just had a major RIF of 20% of my workforce, is it the right time to go ask for this particular tool? Probably not. I think that broader perspective and awareness is really important.
Great answer, Nick. Look, we're coming up to the top of the hour, which is all the time I promised to steal from you today. What's the main takeaway you want listeners to remember from our conversation?
I think the main takeaway is that the blockchain is out there. It's out there for the taking. And there's so many great tools and resources to be able to become a proficient analyst in that particular space. It dovetails so well with the other types of open source investigations and data that's available. And there's few firms who can match open source information with blockchain data and do it well. And so if you don't have confidence in that, go find somebody who can do it when you need it. Otherwise, spend the time to go invest in learning how to do blockchain investigations, because following the money is so critical. And if you can do that and match it to the skill set you have, I think it's tremendously powerful. And we need more people in the space who can do it well.
And Nick, how can listeners reach out and learn more about what you do?
Thanks. Yeah. So red5security.com. That's red, the number 5security.com is how you can find us. And we can consult on a number of different things, particularly around blockchain investigations, crypto investigations, and all kinds of other things too. So happy to talk more, Jan, with anybody who's interested. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there. All
right. I'll be sure to include all the links in the podcast description for this episode. Nick, thanks again for being on the show.
Hey, it was a pleasure. Robert, thank you so much for having me.
Again, that was Nick Gicinto, Executive Vice President at Red 5 Security. Thanks for listening to another episode of Talking Threat Intelligence, sponsored by LifeRaft. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you listen to these shows. And if you'd like more insights on building a successful threat intelligence program, be sure to check out our resource page at liferaftinc.com/blog. That's liferaftinc.com/blog. And I hope you tune in next time.